The most avoidable: construction deaths. Every one of these deaths was preventable. Not in hindsight, preventable at the time, with tools and knowledge that already existed, by people who knew the risk and chose not to act on it. Here are 4 construction disasters where the decision to skip a safety step ended up killing people who had nothing to do with the shortcut. The Hawk's Nest Tunnel. The mountain that killed by design. In the spring of 1930, thousands of men descended on Gauley Bridge, West Virginia, looking for work. The Great Depression had hit hard, and Union Carbide was hiring $3 a day, cash, to dig a 3-mile tunnel through Gauley Mountain for a hydroelectric plant. Most of the workers were black men from the Deep South, many recruited by labor agents who promised steady wages and decent conditions. They got neither. The mountain they were drilling through was 99.4% pure silica sandstone, one of the most hazardous geological formations a tunneler could encounter. The contractors knew this. When workers drill dry through silica rock, the dust fills the air in clouds so thick that, as one survivor later testified, you could practically chew it. Inhaling it causes silicosis, a fatal lung disease that scars the lungs from the inside until a person suffocates over months or years. Silicosis had been documented by medical science since the 1700s. Every properly trained engineer on the site knew what it did. The contractors drilled dry anyway. It was faster. Safety respirators and proper ventilation would have slowed the job and cut into the bonus for early completion. Masks were provided on site, but only for inspectors and company managers. The workers got nothing. Men began dying within 2 months of entering the tunnel, their lungs filled with scar tissue. They collapsed at the face of the rock and were carried out. Those who became too sick to work were driven off the property by a local sheriff acting as an enforcer for the company. Some were put on trains and sent back south to die in homes they hadn't seen in a year. Others were buried on site, in unmarked graves on private farmland, black men and white men in separate plots, with different death payments offered to their families. Unmarried black workers, $400. Married white workers, $1,000. At least 764 men died. Some estimates run as high as 2,000. The exact number will never be known because Union Carbide quietly disposed of the burial records. No one from the company or the contracting firm was ever charged with a crime. A congressional hearing called the Project grave and inhuman disregard for all consideration for the health, lives, and future of the employees. Then Congress passed a law requiring respirators in dusty work sites and moved on. The tunnel still carries water today. Ronan Point, the building that wasn't a building. On the morning of May 16, 1968, a woman named Ivy Hodge went into her kitchen on the 18th floor of the Ronan Point Tower in East London and struck a match to light her stove. The gas explosion that followed wasn't large. Investigators later confirmed it was less powerful than what would damage a person's hearing. It knocked Hodge unconscious and blew out the walls of her apartment. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the entire southeast corner of the 22-story building peeled away from top to bottom. The reason was that Ronan Point had no structural frame. It was built using the Larson-Nielsen large panel system, prefabricated concrete slabs bolted and mortared together, designed for buildings no taller than 6 stories, here used at 22. When later investigators opened the building's joints, they found that many critical connections contained less than 50% of the required mortar. Some had none at all. The building had survived intact only because nothing had yet tested whether it was actually holding together. When one corner's load-bearing wall was removed by the explosion, there was nothing else supporting the floors above. They collapsed sequentially, each falling onto the one below, in what engineers call a progressive collapse. And then the falling weight crushed the floors below too. 4 people died immediately. A 5th died in hospital weeks later. The publicly commissioned inquiry found that the building's design was inadequate and that the construction quality was deficient throughout. It was rebuilt and kept occupied. When it was finally demolished in 1986, engineers found the joints inside were still incorrect. The building had been on the edge of collapse from normal wind load alone for 18 years. L'Ambiance Plaza, 5 seconds, at 1:36 p.m. on April 23, 1987, construction workers at the L'Ambiance Plaza site in Bridgeport, Connecticut, were pouring concrete for the floors of a 16-story apartment building. The technique being used was called lift slab construction. Concrete floor slabs were poured at ground level and then hydraulically jacked up the building's steel columns to their final positions, where they'd be welded into place. At 1:36 and a few seconds later, everything above the third floor was gone. The entire structure, 7 completed floors of a building, collapsed in 5 seconds, which is 2.5 seconds longer than a free-falling object would take to reach the same height from the ground. It fell so fast that many workers had no time to move. 28 men were killed, 22 were injured. Recovery teams worked for 2 days pulling workers from rubble that had compacted to a fraction of its original height. Federal investigators determined the most probable cause was a loss of support at a single lifting jack during the placement of a 3-slab package. The lift slab method required that the hydraulic jacks lifting each floor be capable of handling 2.5 times the anticipated load. Evidence suggested the system hadn't been built to that standard. It was the largest loss of life in a single U.S. construction accident since 51 workers were killed in 1966. OSHA had cited the lift slab technique in previous inspections. After L'Ambiance, the agency imposed a nationwide moratorium on lift slab construction while it conducted a complete safety review. The review took 2 years. The Few Bridge, the crack nobody stopped for. On the morning of March 15, 2018, a brand new 950-ton pedestrian bridge at Florida International University was being prepared for final installation over Southwest 8th Street in Miami. The bridge had been designed and built as a showcase of accelerated construction technology. Its entire main span assembled off to the side of the road, then swung into position over a weekend, so traffic wasn't disrupted for months. It was meant to be a demonstration of modern engineering, done right. The day before, a construction engineer had called the project's engineer of record to report a crack in one of the bridge's structural members. Notes from the call indicate the engineer told him it wasn't a safety concern and that they would address it at a meeting scheduled for later that week. The next morning, workers were on top of the bridge, tightening a post-tensioning rod connected to the cracked member. Traffic was moving normally below. At 1:47 p.m., the entire span collapsed onto Southwest 8th Street, crushing 4 cars. 5 people in those cars were killed. 1 construction worker on top of the bridge also died. 8 others were injured. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation found that a critical structural node in the bridge had been under-designed, that the crack was a direct warning sign of imminent failure, and that the decision to continue work without closing the road or halting the project was the central factor in the deaths. The design firm settled with families for undisclosed amounts. Florida also revoked the engineering licenses of several individuals involved. The road was reopened within weeks. The bridge was removed in pieces. 4 projects. 4 decisions to skip or ignore a step that existed specifically to prevent people from dying. In every case, someone in a position of authority, a contractor, a designer, an engineer on a phone call, had the information they needed. They just didn't stop.